old city of Jerusalem. Right? They do all of this in 6 days, which is why it's considered a miracle by the state of Israel. I mean, it's an unbelievable military performance. So in 6 days, they take what was going to be the war for their destruction, and they proceed to expand their borders from this tiny thing to this, and all of this. Israel then proceeds to give up like all of it, right? So Israel keeps the Golan Heights because that's a military necessity. The UN calls for Israel to withdraw from occupied territories. Now, the language here matters if you care about the UN. I don't happen to care about the UN. I think it's a garbage organization. But if you do care about the UN, there's a resolution put forward by the UN Security Council. It calls for Israel to withdraw from occupied territories, not the occupied territories. Now, that makes a difference because if it said the occupied territories, presumably it would mean anything Israel won, it would have to withdraw from if you care about the UN, which you really shouldn't. But it says occupied territories, which means subject to negotiations. The 67 Arab League summit happens, and they agree in Khartoum, Sudan, on the 3 no's. No peace, no recognition, no negotiations. And these are the 3 no's that are going to govern the Arabs all the way through. Basically until now, until the Abraham Accords. These were the 3 no's that mattered. And this is all the way in 1967. So whenever people talk about there needs to be a 2-state solution, why couldn't they have come to an agreement? Because literally one side said there will be no peace, no recognition, and no negotiations. One side has accepted every single peace deal provided to it to this point in time. And one side has said we will not accept any peace deal. And yet somehow there's a moral equivalency between the 2 sides. Explain that one. Okay, 73, holiest day of the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur. Everybody is fasting, everybody is praying, and a surprise attack is launched on the state of Israel. The prime minister is Golda Meir. She gets caught completely by surprise. They were warned, and they didn't take it seriously. Israel suffers extraordinary casualties in the 73 Yom Kippur War, and then once again maintains or expands its borders a little bit. 79, Camp David Accords. Finally, there's a breakthrough. Menachem Begin takes over as prime minister of Israel, a very right-wing prime minister. There were 2 major parties in Israel at this time, Likud and Labor. This is the first Likud prime minister. And one of the things that he does is he comes to a peace accord with Anwar Sadat, who is the nationalist leader of Egypt. And in those peace accords, Israel gives up the entire Sinai Desert. Israel gives up the entire thing to Egypt in return for basically a cold peace. Anwar Sadat is then assassinated. In 1982, the Jordanian monarchy is deeply afraid that the Palestine Liberation Organization is going to overthrow the monarchy. They expel the Palestinians. The Palestinians end up in Lebanon, tens of thousands of Palestinians. Palestinian terrorist groups begin firing rockets over into Israel from South Lebanon. In 1982, Menachem Begin launches a war in Lebanon. Israel ends up basically going all the way up to the capital of Beirut and nearly occupying the entire country. And then they end up withdrawing under international pressure in what is considered sort of a disastrous war for the state of Israel. As always, whenever Israel withdraws from a territory, terrorist groups take over and then threaten Israel. This is the constant pattern. No matter, the only time this has not happened is with regard to withdrawal from the Sinai Desert. 1987, the Intifada breaks out. This is the Palestinians in the Judea and Samaria region. The reason that I use the terms Judea and Samaria is they are more historically accurate. People call it the West Bank. Why? Because Jordan occupied it, and this is the West Bank of the Jordan River. So the only reason that it's referred to as the West Bank, which is really historically anomalous, right? It's on the east side of Israel, but it's on the West Bank of the Jordan. That's a holdover from the time when the Jordanians occupied this entire area. Again, no one cares that Jordan occupied quote-unquote Palestinian land or that Egypt occupied quote-unquote Palestinian land. They only care when Jews occupy historically Jewish land. That's when things start to get really hot and bothered. Okay, so anyway, the Intifada breaks out in 1987. You get these widespread riots and violent confrontations and terrorist attacks all the way from 1987 to 1991. By this time, Yitzhak Rabin has taken over as prime minister of Israel, and pushed by George H.W. Bush, the government of the state of Israel starts negotiating with the Palestine Liberation Organization, which is a really weird shift considering that Yasser Arafat is a master terrorist responsible for tons of murders on his hands. He at this point has been expelled all the way to Tunis, right? He's not even in the picture. And Israel brings him out of retirement basically and says, why don't we negotiate with you? And maybe you can make all of this stop. So in 1993, they signed the Oslo Accords, and that is where you get Bill Clinton presiding over one of the least successful international negotiations in the history of international politics. The Oslo Accords have been a complete and utter failure. That ends with Yitzhak Rabin, who's this historic general who has been prime minister of Israel a couple of times by this point, shaking hands with a mass murdering terrorist, Yasser Arafat. And this was going to initiate a new period of health and accord, and there was going to be peace. All that the PLO had to do was acknowledge that Israel existed and had a right to exist, stop educating their children in terrorism, and cease the violence. They couldn't do any of those things, right? So none of that happened. Instead, there's an uptick in violence, pretty dramatic uptick in violence after the Oslo Accords. In 1998, Israel again attempts to make some sort of concessions to the Palestinians, this time under the first tenure of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Israel does not want to govern these areas. Israel is not interested in governing millions of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip or in Judea and Samaria. The last thing they want to do is have their soldiers wandering around these dangerous areas or to preside over these areas. All they want, and all Israel has ever wanted, is to separate off from these particular areas and say, listen, you guys rule yourselves. Like, just stop bothering us, please. Okay, and you will see that this is the continued pattern. 2000, Israel engages in the Camp David negotiations. Bill Clinton is still president at this point, and the prime minister of Israel is now a guy named Ehud Barak. And Ehud Barak is a real dove. Ehud Barak wants to make as many concessions as humanly possible, right? This picture here, which is just an unbelievable picture. Bill Clinton and Ehud Barak trying to push Yasser Arafat into negotiating, right? They're all joking, they're all happy and all this kind of crap. Ehud Barak offered everything. Ehud Barak offered complete control over the Temple Mount with just like a little bit of a recognition that Israel has a historic claim religiously to the Temple Mount. Arafat turned it down flat. He offered control over virtually all of Judea and Samaria. He offered control over the Gaza Strip, right? A Palestinian state, boom, done. Arafat does not even negotiate. He just launches a massive round of violence. I remember this because I was actually in Israel right about the time they launched the Intifada, and there were suicide bombings on a fairly regular basis. They blew up a Sparrow's pizza shop. I was supposed to be at that corner like a couple of hours later. This was a thing that was really scary. It was really violent. Remember, he launched that not after Israel did something aggressive. He launched that after Israel offered him everything he could possibly want if he weren't a damned liar who just wanted Israel wiped off the map. This, again, is the great lie, is that there is desire for a two-state solution from the Palestinian side. So far, there has been no evidence whatsoever that this is the case. Okay, 2004, Arafat dies, and Mahmoud Abbas takes over. Mahmoud Abbas is himself a terror supporter. He wrote his entire doctoral dissertation on Holocaust denial and why it's correct. Israel, in 2005, under the auspices of Ariel Sharon, who's one of the great hawks in Israeli history, right? He was the general in the 1973 war who ended up pushing all the way down close to Cairo. He was called the bulldozer. He's this famous general. He unilaterally withdraws from the Gaza Strip. There are a bunch of Jewish areas right in the northern tip of the Gaza Strip. Jewish soldiers went in and removed Jewish settlements in the Gaza Strip. These are places people have lived for decades. They removed them, and they just turned them over to the Palestinians. Hamas, a terrorist group, immediately rushed in and burned everything. They burned the greenhouses, they burned all the Jewish houses, they knocked down all the good infrastructure, and then they just took over the place. This is when you start to see a difference emerging among the Palestinians in terms of governance. You've got Judea and Samaria, the West Bank here, you've got the Gaza Strip here. In 2005, Abbas wins the Palestinian elections, but only because Hamas and Islamic Jihad boycott the elections. Okay, in 2006, after Israel withdraws from Gaza, remember, Israel's not in control of anything here now. Hamas wins an election. So the first move is not, oh, look, Israel wants to make concessions and make peace with us. The first move is, why don't we elect a terrorist group to actually represent us? Okay, in 2008, Israel's response to this is, what if we just offer you everything? So Ehud Olmert becomes prime minister of Israel, and he proceeds to offer everything to Abbas. He gives him basically the same offer, but better than the offer that Barak gave in 2000. He offers everything. He offers Judea and Samaria. He says, we're going to keep some of the big Israeli settlements that exist here, but we're going to give you land swaps. You can keep the Gaza Strip, everything. Abbas does not even bother to issue a counteroffer. He just walks away from the table and launches violence. Gaza war begins 2008, missiles flying in from Gaza. This is the first Gaza war. Israel has to go in Operation Cast Lead and shut that down. 2014, this breaks out again. Another giant rocket attack from Hamas in Gaza. Israel has to go back in 2014 and shut it down. And that brings us to today, 2021, another Gaza war in which Hamas has decided to launch rockets at the state of Israel. The real reason for that has nothing to do with land disputes in Jerusalem. The real reason has to do with the fact that Mahmoud Abbas was about to hold an election in April. He canceled it because he knew he was going to lose to Hamas. As always, the best way to garner support when it appears that you're about to go down is to start blaming the Jews and start trying to kill them. You can start an arms race between yourself and Hamas on how many Jews they can kill. So that brings us to where we are right now in 2021. So Hamas is an actual terrorist group. Fatah, which is the military wing of the Palestinian Authority, is a terrorist group as well, and Islamic Jihad. So you have three terrorist groups running this area right here. And again, Israel has no interest in running those areas. It's the last thing that Israel really wants. It's the reason why Israel has not gone and reinvaded these areas or thrown Hamas out. They don't want their soldiers in these particular areas. What Israel has done, because they don't wish to be involved in these full-scale wars, is they've developed the Iron Dome system. So the Iron Dome system is really an incredible piece of technology. Okay, so Hamas has been firing rockets at the center of Israel. Israel is a very, very tiny state. If you were to fire a rocket from the Gaza Strip to Jerusalem, you have about 90 seconds warning before the rocket hits. Tel Aviv, which is up here, if you hit Tel Aviv, that's again a 90-second warning. If you're in Ashdod or Ashkelon, which are down here, you're getting like 15, 30 seconds warning before the rockets hit. So Israel develops this incredible technology called Iron Dome. This is what an Iron Dome battery looks like. You can see that they load up the battery with a bunch of essentially anti-missile missiles. That's what they are. There is an enemy rocket that is fired, Israel has these very precise radar systems that track the rocket launches. Then there's a control system that estimates the impact point where it's going to hit. And then they fire a launcher to intercept the missile. And it doesn't bother defending against rockets that are going to land in the middle of nowhere. They have these batteries that are set up in all of Israel's major cities. Iron Dome is basically a technological miracle. They're hitting a bullet with a bullet. And they're doing so with no time to basically figure out how to do it. It's right now succeeding at about 90% rate, which means, by the way, that Israel gets to be nicer to Hamas than it otherwise would be. Because if all these rockets were actually hitting all the populated areas of Israel, Israel would just eviscerate Hamas. Like any other state, it would have no choice but to go in on the ground and just finish the job, which is why if Hezbollah in the north, right, on the northern Lebanese border, decides that it wants to launch a war against Israel, they have way more ordnance than Hamas does. And so Israel would be forced to go in full scale and just do what it would have to do. Right? Israel is being incredibly pinpointed about the way that it deals with this conflict. It's dropping knock bombs on top of buildings. They're bombs that basically shake the building and say, get out. And then they bomb the building after everybody gets out. They're calling building managers and telling them to leave. We have tape of them telling building managers, clear the building. And the building managers being like, well, we don't want to. And the Israelis saying, well, yeah, but there are kids inside. And the building manager being like, okay, well, if you kill kids, then it's a good propaganda win for us. It's unbelievable. And yet somehow the world sees some sort of moral equivalence there. Now, there are some international political implications that have changed in the recent past with regard to Israel. I've dealt with just specifically here the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But one of the things that has happened that is really quite massive is that if you go back here, Israel currently has a cold peace with Egypt. Israel has kind of a cold peace with Jordan. And because the Obama administration really has strengthened Iran, the three no's of Khartoum, which you'll remember were no peace, no recognition, no negotiation, they've completely disappeared for a wide variety of Arab states, which have decided, guess what, the Jews aren't our enemy, Iran is our enemy. And so this is how you ended up with the Abraham Accords, where the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco, all of which have been supportive of these various wars of extinction against the Jewish state, have now decided that they're going to form a quite warm peace with Israel and recognize Israel's existence. That fundamentally changed the math on the ground. Meanwhile, the Biden administration is trying to walk that back by attempting to provide support to the radicalized Palestinian government of Fatah or of the Hamas or of Islamic Jihad.